Chapter 5 The Road to Comachos. Keith was on his way to the scrapyard to get rid of the car. He was still in the daze from the heist that morning, and he still didn't know how he got involved in jacking a load of dope. He was told that he would supply a car and a van, and that he would drive the car and block the parts van so that Pug and Louie could jack the parts. Then he was to get rid of the car, and Louie and Pug would take the van. That was it. He was never supposed to get out of the car. He was never told about any dope. The whole drive to the scrapyard, he ran the morning through his head. The yard was just outside the industrial part of town, not far from the heist. The further he got, the rougher the road got from years of heavy truck traffic. Leading up to every stop sign were ripples in the road where big trucks had pushed up the asphalt. The old road's color of pale gray was littered with garbage and steel drums. It winded further away from civilization until fenced-off fields and abandoned buildings lined its shoulders. The road to the scrapyard followed the approach path for airplanes to the airport. Jumbo jets passed by about every 2 minutes, making one hell of a racket. Keith could hear them coming in a high-pitched whine, and once one passed, the rumble from those big jet engines rattled his teeth, and the heat they let out blurred the sky. For a moment he thought that maybe he should get on one of those planes and take a break from it all. Beyond the planes were the big container cranes unloading ships. Ships waited for miles out to sea to be brought in and unloaded. The further Keith drove along the road, the more desolate things got, until planes, cranes, and big steel bridges off in the distance were all that was left. A block from the scrapyard, the paved road turned to grease-soaked dirt and rock. At the end of the road, a mile-long fence with a swing gate that swung open like the grand entrance and exposed the sign, Comachos, scrap metal dealer. Keith stopped short of the gate, and he thought about the road he took to Comachos. He grew up jacking cars. Since he was 12 years old, he worked for a parts theft ring. The guys thought it was cute when they jimmied the car door open and sent the kid in to rip out a part. That kind of thing went on for a while until Keith was being sent out his own to jack parts, and that went on for a while too. Never having been caught by the cops, he got a reputation as the kid who could get you parts without any trouble, and stolen auto parts were such a good commodity, jacking parts was good business for the kid. Sitting in front of Comachos brought a realization down on Keith. This ain't no kid shit anymore. Today he didn't jack a car. That old man driving the van, he ain't the person who got jacked. No, the people who got jacked weren't there. The people who got jacked were most fucking definitely going to come looking for their property. As he looked past the gate into Comachos, he wondered what the fuck was going to happen when these people come looking for their dope. He looked over the moonscape of flattened cars and out into the train yard. When these people come looking for their property, they're not going to go after Louis Jr. Everyone knew that Louis Jr. was the son of Louis Lubertazzi Sr., a made guy. No one is going to fuck with the Lubertazzis. No, they're going to go after the nobody. Keith knew if he got caught, they would beat the piss out of him until he gave up the dope. He didn't know where Pug and Louie went with the dope, and none of that even mattered. They're going to give him the beating they can't give to Louie. Keith looked beyond all the scrap and Comachos and far out to the rail yard where train cars were being jockeyed around until they lined up sometimes miles long behind the engine. That dope was a liability, and whoever was involved was a target. Jacking a load of dope was not what he signed up for. He never was supposed to push around an old man. He was never supposed to get out of the blocking car. He thought Louie and Pug were jacking a load of car parts. Instead, they were jacking a load of dope. Who the fuck thought that was going to be a good idea? Keith snapped out of it. He let his mind run away for a while, and now he shook his head and he got his thoughts back. All he was doing was getting rid of a car. That's all he had to do. Watch this car get crushed at Comachos and go home. That's what he was paid for, and that was the extent of his involvement. That's what he told himself, and that thought would have to get him through the day. Keith put the car in drive and drove past the gate into Comachos. This was the first time Keith was ever at Comachos. He had set this thing up through his contact Camilo, who had flatbedded dozens of stripped cars for him to be scrapped. Although he heard of the place Comachos, he never knew his contact Camilo was taking the cars there until he set this thing up. Camilo always took care of all the details, asked no questions, and never told him where he was taking the cars. That arrangement was fine with both of them. If anything ever went wrong, no one knew anything. And once Camilo took a car, it was gone. The car, the parts, nothing ever turned up again. Beyond the open gate was a scrapyard, an oil-soaked dirt lot cratered with long, deep ruts filled with green water topped with a skim of oil. On each side of the yard were steel buildings with big bays. Beyond the buildings was a half-mile of crushed cars lined up in rows. He drove down the rutted yard looking for the one steel building where Camilo told him to go, the depollution bay. Keith drove slow over the cratered yard looking for the building with the sign, Depollution Bay. Keith ran the instructions Camilo gave him through his head as he drove through the yard. Keith drove past one building after another until he pulled up to the building that had one large bay and a sign that read Depollution Bay. He parked the car right in front of the bay so anyone could see if they looked. He sat in the car like Camilo told him to do. He sat there trying to forget about the day. There wasn't anyone around. A yard dog walked out of one of the steel buildings. The short-haired, filthy mutt stopped and looked over at Keith for a moment, then turned away. He held his head high in the air, and with sight and smell he surveyed his territory. He stood motionless. Then his ears turned. Then his head turned. Then he took off seriously down a canyon formed by the mountains of crushed cars. Keith could hear his barking long after he disappeared. Keith was staring down the canyon of cars when he heard bang, bang, bang on the door. Keith jerked away from the blows on the door. He looked out the side window and saw a big Puerto Rican standing there. Keith sat there, his body jacked up and his nerves on edge. The big Puerto Rican spun his finger around, motioning Keith to roll down the window. When Keith got the window down, the Puerto Rican said, "Joe, can I help you, men?" Keith took a gulp of air and said, "Yeah, I want to scrap the car." "You have an appointment?" "Yeah, Camilo sent me." The Puerto Rican looked the car over and said, "Camilo sent you here?" "Yeah, Camilo sent me. He said to give you this." Keith gave the Puerto Rican the $1,000 Camilo said it would cost to scrap the car. The big Puerto Rican took the money and said, "You wait here. We have a couple cars we have to get out of the bay, then we scrap the car." The Puerto Rican walked around the front of the car and looked it over. Then he walked away into the depollution bay. Keith followed the Puerto Rican with his eyes, then looked down the canyon, but there was no sight of the dog. Keith sat there another 20 minutes in the car waiting. Then bang, bang, bang again. Keith looked out the side window and saw the big Puerto Rican was standing there. He rolled down the window and the Puerto Rican said, "You come with me." Keith opened the door and got out of the car. "I was told I can watch the car scrap. That's what the gram was for, right?" "Yeah, you watch the car. You go that way." The Puerto Rican pointed into the depollution bay. "You watch the first step there." Keith walked over to the bay and the Puerto Rico followed him. Once they were inside, the Puerto Rican pointed to the back corner. "You stand there, out of the way." Keith walked over to the back corner and waited, and the Puerto Rican waited with him. After a while, a forklift carrying Keith's car came into the bay. The forklift stopped and some workers went over to the car with impact guns and removed the wheels. The car was lowered and one man opened the hood and removed the battery. Another man proceeded to remove other parts from under the hood, and when the men were done, they moved away from the car and the car was lifted and put high on a stand. The workers were able to stand straight up under the car and they went right to work. The work went on under the car and Keith watched. The Puerto Rican stood against the wall with his hands in his pockets and his head down, studying the floor, showing no interest. Outside the depollution bay, a car pulled up, parked blocking the bay, and 3 men got out. When they got out of the car, they stood outside and talked amongst themselves. They were obviously interested in what was going on with Keith's car because when they were done talking, they stood there watching what was going on inside. Keith noticed the Puerto Rican look over at the men. He asked the Puerto Rican, "Who are they?" "Them? They wait for the bay." The men continued working under Keith's car. One man wheeled a hand truck with a large steel drum and put it under the car. The man attached a metal pipe to the bottom of the car's fuel tank and the other end of the pipe into a fitting on top of the steel drum. Keith asked the Puerto Rican, "What's that they're doing now?" "That remove the fuel. It punch the hole in the fuel tank and fuel go in the drum." We can no crush the car with the fuel." Keith watched as the men worked. Every part that came off that car was a weight off his mind. That car would be done soon and his involvement in the heist would be over. There was a short break in the noise the men made tearing apart the car. Keith listened hard, but he couldn't hear the dog. The men drained the oil and the radiator fluid and continued pulling parts off the car. Outside, a well-dressed man walked over to the men who were waiting for the bay and spoke with them, and the Puerto Rican looked over at the men from time to time. After a while, a large black car pulled up outside the bay alongside the first car. Two large men got out and another two remained in the back seat. The two large men walked over to the men who were already waiting for the bay and spoke with them. Keith asked the Puerto Rican, "Why are they pulling so many parts off the car?" The Puerto Rican answered, "Some of the parts no crush, too hard, they take out." The two large men finished talking outside and came into the depollution bay. They walked to the car and looked it over. They walked around the car and watched the men work. When they were done looking, they walked over to Keith and the Puerto Rican. Both the men ignored Keith, and one of them reached out to shake the Puerto Rican's hand and said, "Hola." The Puerto Rican replied, "Hola," and shook the man's hand. The man said to the Puerto Rican, "Traemos un hombre." The Puerto Rican replied, "Sí, mi jefe me dijo." With a friendly smile, one man looked at the other large man, then back at the Puerto Rican. "Bien, hagámoslo." One large man looked at Keith, nodded once and smiled. Then both of the large men turned and walked back outside. Keith asked the Puerto Rican, "What's that all about?" The Puerto Rican replied, "Hey, they wait for the bay." Keith turned away from the Puerto Rican and muttered sarcastically, "Hey, everyone wait for the bay." The large men returned to their car. Keith returned his attention to the depollution process. The large men opened the rear door of the black car and an old man got out. Another large man got out of the other rear door of the car. The group of large men with the old man behind them walked into the depollution bay. They stopped 20 feet from Keith and the Puerto Rican. When Keith looked over at the group of men, the old man was standing in front of them and Keith's blood ran cold. The old man looked at Keith and got angry and said something in Spanish to one of the large men. The old man showed Keith his fist and grunted something at him as if an old hated memory had returned. One of the large men stepped in front of the old man and turned him around. Keith's nerves rattled. The group of men guided the old man out of the depollution bay. One large man remained behind and nodded to the Puerto Rican. Right then, Keith's vision went dark, his knees buckled, and his world went silent.